Great, thank you. So Tim Lomas, who will be joining us in a second, is an author, lecturer, researcher, and lecturer particularly in positive psychology, until recently at the University of East London and now at Harvard. His books include the Lexicography of Intranslatable Words or Untranslatable Words. I knew I wouldn't even be able to say the words, let alone translate them. And the Happiness Dictionary, Words from Around the World That Help Us to Lead a Richer Life. Two fantastic titles. And for the purposes, the reason why we've managed to corner him today is because of his meta-analysis, systematic review analysis of the data around the effectiveness of mindfulness, particularly in the workplace. And Tim's just joined us. So he knows nothing about what I've just said, could have made it all up, and he can't deny it. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, great to have you with us. Great to see you. I've just done your introduction, so if you don't like it, I'm sorry. When you look back at the recording, I can only apologize. And Megan Reitz is listed 50 Thinkers Radar of Global Management Thinkers. 2019 HR's Most Influential List of Thinkers. Has recently published Speaking Truth to Power, which has articles featured 5 times in the Harvard Business School, and this was written with John Higgins, and that's been the subject of a TED Talk and was shortlisted for the CMI Management Book of the Year 2020. To be brutally honest, I could spend the next hour doing the introductions for these two individuals, so incredibly honoured to have you with us, and thank you for making the time for being part of our community today. The reason we have particularly invited you guys along, as you well know, is that Megan has been working for a substantial period of time with a lot of experience and a very broad perspective of what works in terms of talking to leaders and with leaders, including the skeptical, about mindfulness and how mindfulness can help in leadership. And he's also co-author of Mind Time, with Michael Cheskausen. So again, a lot of experience in that sort of world. And Tim, as I said in the introduction, is the author or did the research into this significant piece of meta-analysis of mindfulness. And so very kindly, they've come along to talk to us today, sort of giving us the broad perspective and then a bit more detailed research perspective. And we have, and Tim may be sharing some slides with us, and I believe, Tim, that you're kindly going to be offering those to community members as well, which is very generous. So really, I think probably best to start, Tim, could you give us some broad views around your meta-analysis? Because one of the big challenges for us as either workplace champions or as trainers is really being credible, getting in the door. Once we've got in the door, sometimes it's easy to demonstrate to people the effectiveness of what we're offering and what we're suggesting. But actually, what did the meta-analysis show you? Could you give us some insights into that experience?
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. Apologies for my issues connecting. Teresa, do you have the slides to share? I don't know how this will work. Okay, so I've just prepared a few slides just because there's some details I'd like to share. So mindfulness in the workplace. I'm Tim Lomas. I think Andrew's given me an introduction. Hopefully he said something nice. I trust him. So I'm Tim Lomas. Just briefly about me. I've been into meditation and Buddhism for over 20 years. I taught English in China when I was 19 and traveled around and visited monasteries and so on, and started to develop a practice then and became very interested in the theory of it. Some years later, I did a PhD on meditation and men's mental health, looking at its impact on male practitioners in London specifically. I won't go into details, but lots around gender and masculinity and men's issues connecting, but then connecting emotionally, meditation helping them and so on. And then I've spent the past 7 years as a lecturer in positive psychology at the University of East London, looking broadly at different aspects of well-being. I suppose my main focus, besides meditation, well, now my main focus is on sort of cross-cultural perspectives on well-being. So I'm due to take up a research position in the States soon, hopefully once I get my work visa. So, as I say, I've been interested in meditation and Buddhism for many years, and as part of that interest, I connected with the Mindfulness Initiative, I think back in 2016, and joined the kind of the workplace working group, and this intersected with my interest in mindfulness, obviously, and I thought it'd be interesting to bring together a team of people to conduct a series of systematic reviews and meta-analysis on mindfulness in the workplace to get a sense of what is the current understanding with respect to the value of mindfulness in the workplace and so on. So if you could change the slides, Teresa. So it was essentially one overarching effort which broke down into a series of papers. So the two I'll be mentioning particularly today are the top two, because as I'll go into detail, we collected around 160 papers across all spheres of occupation. And that was the first broad, the broad, I just noticed I've repeated, no. Yeah. There was a broad systematic review of all of these 160 papers, and then we had a more focused meta-analysis of around 35 papers. Then we also published a few papers just delving into the details with regard to specific spheres of occupation, so healthcare and education specifically. But I'll be sharing the details from just a broad overarching systematic review focusing on all occupational spheres, and then also the meta-analysis of a subsection of that broad review. If you could change the slide, Teresa. So for the overarching systematic review across all occupations, I won't go into the laborious details about how we do the systematic review, but essentially wading through as many papers as you can find through the various academic search engines, and located kind of 721 potentially relevant papers. Then there's a process of weeding these out based on inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we basically wanted to focus on experimental trials in the workplace. So as a result of picking the ones that fit our criteria, there was 153 papers included in the review. Of these, there was 112 was some kind of mindfulness-based intervention. So I'm sure you're familiar with many of these. So obviously mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, but there's many other adaptations and also many just bespoke ones designed for that particular study. Then also there was 41 non-intervention empirical studies. So not looking at an experimental intervention per se, but just, for example, surveying levels of mindfulness and other relevant outcomes, conducting correlation and regression analyses. So just looking for patterns of association between mindfulness and other outcomes. So quite a lot of participants, so over 12,000. So almost 6,000 of these were in the intervention studies and almost 7,000 in the non-intervention. Okay, if you could just change that, Teresa. So I will share these slides, so I won't have to go through every number and so on, but just to give you an overall sense of what's going on here with this table, we looked at a range of metrics pertaining to well-being. And obviously well-being is a very expansive concept, but you could look at it in deficit-based terms as the absence of some undesirable outcome, or asset-based terms in the presence of some desirable outcome. So obviously, in kind of deficit-based terms, you have outcomes like anxiety, burnout, depression, distress and anger, stress and strain, and so on. So obviously, a good result in terms of mindfulness in the workplace would be a reduction in these negative constructs, so to speak. Then you can also look at well-being in more positive asset-based terms and the presence of desirable outcomes like compassion and empathy, emotional intelligence, job performance, and so on. There tend to be fewer studies on these more positive aspects because a lot of the research has been driven by the way in which mindfulness has been harnessed in clinical settings. So the bulk of mindfulness research tends to focus on outcomes such as anxiety and depression, understandably. But so there's less of a focus on these more positive constructs, like, you know, resilience, satisfaction, and so on. But there are some, obviously. So you can see the first column there on the very left-hand side, we've got the different outcomes. The second column is just the number of studies to give you a sense of how many studies assess these. As I'll go on to in a subsequent slide, each of these constructs on the left-hand side, oh, sorry, if you can stay on that slide, Teresa. Just to say though, each of these constructs in the left-hand column, they're in themselves complex and multifaceted. So there's different ways of constructing and construing like anxiety, different scales for measuring it. So these aren't unidimensional constructs. But anyway, we could aggregate these together and say there were, for example, 25 studies looking at anxiety in some form. And of these, 17 found some kind of improvement relating to mindfulness intervention, 5 found no change, 1 found a worsening related to mindfulness introduction, which is, I think we'll come on to this, but an important caveat to note that they're, you know, it's not an unequivocal good necessarily. Some people can find it difficult or challenging, and it might not always be harmful. And then the final column on the right-hand side was just the non-intervention studies finding just some pattern of association. So levels of mindfulness would correlate, for example, with, well, inversely correlate with levels of anxiety and so on. So as I said, I'll share these slides and they're on the published papers. But as you can see, you can go through each of these constructs and see just generally an overall pattern of general picture of improvement. So, you know, burnout, 33% of studies showed an improvement, 11 no change, 3 worsening outcome. So like I say, generally a favorable picture, but you know, it's important to keep in mind the 4th and 5th columns along, to note that we want to be realistic in our appraisal of the value of mindfulness, and there are plenty of studies, it's a minority, but it's still a substantial minority, that don't show an improvement, and some that even show some worsening. I should just caveat that when I say no improvement, I mean statistically, because it's possible that you can detect some kind of an improvement, but when you run the statistical analysis, it doesn't rise to what's called the level of significance. So it could just be an artifact of the study. It could just have happened by chance. So I won't go into the detailed stats, but sometimes there could seem to be trends in a positive direction, but it just didn't rise to the level of significance. So in that case, it would count as no change. But anyway, you can see the general pattern where mostly a vast majority do show an improvement. Some studies show no improvement, and like a handful show some worsening outcomes. Okay, if you could change the slide, Teresa. So that was the general review, and then we conducted a meta-analysis of a subset of that review. So if you want the details, here's what's called like a Prisma plot, which shows a flow chart for how we extracted articles and kind of waded through them and weeded out the irrelevant ones and selected the relevant ones. So essentially, you can see towards the bottom, reasons we excluded full text articles. Like they weren't about mindfulness, they weren't an empirical study, they didn't pertain to work, they weren't in English, and they weren't randomized control trials, which gave us 47 papers meeting all these criteria. Of these 47, we had to exclude a further 12 because there wasn't data provided, and we, you know, tried to ask the authors but couldn't obtain it. So in the end, we had 35 papers. And Teresa, if you could just change the slide again. So here it gets a bit more granular, and I won't go into, again, all the details, but again, you can see on the very left-hand column, the various outputs of interest, the outcomes of interest, then the number of studies assessing them. The third column is interesting because, again, I mentioned that these various constructs are multidimensional. There's different ways of construing and constructing and assessing them. So there's different scales. So as you can see, there's like 4 different anxiety scales, but in the meta-analysis, we essentially aggregated these together and to look for the impact. So there's 2 significant columns when it comes to the numbers. The first is the SMD, standardized mean difference, which kind of shows the extent of the impact. And then the 5th column of numbers along, which is P, which shows the significance level. So just roughly, like in psychology studies, if P probability is below 0.05, that's considered significant. So it means there's kind of fewer than a 1 in 20 chance that it was obtained by chance, the result. So if P is below 0.05, that shows it's statistically significant. So as you can see, with anxiety and burnout, what these numbers indicate that there was a significant reduction in anxiety and burnout. The effect was larger for anxiety because it's 0.57 and smaller for burnout, 0.36. But either way, there was a significant reduction overall in anxiety and burnout. Third, we have compassion, empathy. So obviously this is a positive number because there's a negative sign next to anxiety and burnout in the SND column showing that there was a reduction in these, which is what we want ideally. Obviously, compassion and empathy, it's a positive number showing that there was an increase in compassion and empathy. A reduction in depression, but as you'll notice from the P number, this is above 0.05. So this is what I was talking about, where it was trending in what you'd call a good direction from the point of view wanting to reduce depression, but it wasn't significant in that respect. A significant reduction in distress, emotional regulation. Again, it was above significant, so that wouldn't be considered a statistically significant result. Teresa, if you could change it again. So just a few more outcomes to mention. Health, we could see a general increase in health with various ways of assessing that. So that's quite significant, less than 0.001. And again, quite a strong effect size there with 0.63. I think an improvement in job performance, again, lots of different ways of assessing that. As you'd expect, an improvement in mindfulness, and there's lots of different ways that was assessed. And then just one more slide, Teresa, please. General and kind of a strong reduction in stress, assessed in various different ways, which is interesting because, a lot of the research involves self-report measures, which are fine and useful, but have their issues. But there's a lot of also kind of physiological measures of stress, which that kind of triangulation is helpful to show that it's not just people's subjective experience of stress, though that is obviously relevant and useful. And then also just various metrics of positive well-being, which is just this huge overarching label for different kind of constructs: job satisfaction, resilience, satisfaction in life, meaning, purpose, and so on. And again, a significant effect with respect to improvements in positive well-being, so to speak. Okay, I think that's it for my brief summary. So I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, thank you. That was just so rich in everything that you were sharing there, and lots to digest. Megan, I mean, how does that translate to your experience of working with leaders, of convincing leaders? How does that relate to your experience?
Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you, Tim. That was fascinating. I had my pen out and I was noticing. So a brief bit about my work. I personally have been interested in mindfulness and meditation practice for about 20 years and had an on-off relationship with it, luckily more on recently. My work is in leadership development, and around about 2015, Michael Chaskelson, who is a friend of mine, approached me and said, well, shall we just see whether this mindfulness stuff has got anything to do with what you're trying to develop leaders with? And we embarked on an 8-week mindfulness intervention with 57 leaders at Ashridge. So it was a program that had like 4 workshops in it and then daily practice, hopefully. We measured how much people practiced, and we measured an awful lot of things around these poor people for 8 weeks. And it was a big qualitative study as well. And I think that's, yes, a big quantitative study. I will hold my hands up to say that fortunately, my colleagues are much more skilled in quantitative study than I am. But we published that recently in the Journal of Management Development. And we recorded our 57 leaders in each of the workshops without us there. Obviously, they knew they were being recorded. We recorded them talking about how they'd experienced practice and any effect or none with how they perceived their leadership to be changing. And so we had 27 hours worth of them talking about that process and that journey, which was transcribed and then coded. And so I guess I will just, I'll share two things very briefly. There you go. So actually, I'll come to this first. So when we coded this tremendous amount of data, we ended up picking out three things that our participants had kind of honed in on around what they felt had changed, what they felt was what were the important aspects of meditation practice that showed up in their leadership world that then made a difference. And we called this this model the AIM model, which we wrote about in Mind Time. And we've also actually just, if you're interested, that we published an article in Harvard Business Review in August last year on team mindfulness around this model. And that was more of a kind of an opinion piece. But what people were saying was that, there was a strong identification with, okay, I notice that I am, as we call it, allowing more. In other words, I have two capacities. I'm able more so to accept reality, accept what is the case, rather than fighting against it and wishing it wasn't. And that ends up being quite a big deal for many of the leaders and managers I work with. The other aspect of allowing that came through was this noticing that they weren't blaming and pointing and judging other people quite as much, or at least if they were, they noticed it. And then they had some choice around it. So there was a theme that came out around allowing. The other theme was around inquiry. So we had participants in the study that noticed that obviously in the meditation practices that we were using, which were predominantly based on Michael's book, you might have read Mindfulness in 8 Weeks. So we used a lot of MBSR, MBCT type mindfulness practices with them. And a lot of them inquiry, what's going on, what's happening, what are you noticing? And so many participants noticed that in their workplace, they were inquiring more. Even, when they're sat around a table with their colleagues, they were questioning, or they felt that they were questioning more and checking out some of their assumptions. And the third thing which makes up the AIM model is meta-awareness. So the capacity to catch oneself, to wake up to thoughts and feelings, sensations in that present moment. So to notice that intimate detachment, that observation of what's happening, and that together. So I'll take you onto a different slide now. We created what we call the theory of mindful leadership, and in the middle you'll see AIM, so allowing, inquiry, and meta awareness. So let me just explain what this says, and then I'll be quiet a bit. What we were seeing was because our participants noticed that they were allowing, inquiring, and being able to be more meta aware. This opened up one thing that, now this is my words here, provocatively I could say it's the most important leadership capacity that there is, which is the space to respond. So the combination of these factors through meditation practice seem to enable people to catch themselves with awareness, which in turn opened up choices that weren't present for them when they were on automatic pilot. Now, when they caught themselves and kind of went, oh, look what's happening, and then they had that space to respond, through the coding, there were 5 things that they identified that changed in particular, and they're there, you know: emotional regulation, empathy, focus, adaptability, and perspective taking. And I should say that, you know, the reason what we were testing in our study in particular was 3 leadership capacities that were at the time, and still are, mentioned as 3 of the most important leadership development areas: resilience, collaboration, and this kind of agility in complexity. So that's what we were measuring. And this model allowed us to start to, and still allows us now, because I work with groups of leaders, many of whom are highly skeptical on the value of benefit of mindfulness. So this is one way I explain it to them, working up from, you know, you're developing those things in the middle through your meditation practice. It enables you to sort of have this perspective that gives you choice in the midst of your crazy days, which are manically, you know, busy. That enables you to potentially more of the time regulate your emotions, empathize, etc., etc. And you can probably see how those red areas relate to those key areas of resilience, collaboration, and agility. So when I'm with leaders, I tend to start with what is on their mind. And what's on their mind is very often, how can I be more resilient? How can I lead resilient teams? How can I be more collaborative and lead collaborative teams? And how can I kind of be focused and be agile in this world that we're in? And that's the way I kind of build up and try and explain some of the things that we found in our study. On the quant side, we found a number of things, as you'll see on the left-hand side, and there are a few things we didn't find, and we detail all of that in the research report that we published. I won't go into all of that. I will if you want me to, but I'll stop sharing there, and that hopefully just gives you this sort of picture of firstly our study. It was as far as we knew, but Tim would be able to tell me, I think it may have been the first waitlist control study examining leadership capacity back then. As I said, if you wanted to read more, it's only just been published. That's my fault for not managing to get around to it earlier. And it has been useful and is useful in helping leaders identify where mindfulness might help their practice as a leader. And the very final thing I will say is that my area of interest right now, which again I will talk more about if you want me to, is in relation to the other big project of work I'm doing on speaking truth to power. And that is around our habits. So you and I have habits around what we say and when we stay silent. And we also have habits around whose voices we hear in organizational systems and obviously at home and everywhere, but who we listen to and who we discount. And we fall into habits ourselves, and our teams fall into habits around what gets said and what doesn't, and whose voice gets heard and whose doesn't. And my area of fascination and obsession right now is, how do you enable people to spot and become aware of those habits so that they then have choice in their response? So you can start to disrupt habits of speaking and listening. And that's a big topic at the moment, around, for all sorts of reasons, big topic in terms of inclusion and diversity and inclusion, obviously, but also a big topic around how do you help voices that are silent in order to create more ethical and innovative organizations. So, Andrew, there you go. That was a very quick kind of download. As soon as I started speaking, I thought, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure which bits to focus on. There's been quite a lot, but over to you, Andrew.
Well, you know, there's a reason I said that I could have quite happily spent the hour just introducing you both, because this is such a wealth of information and experience. So I just want to bring Tim in for a moment, just to sort of check in. How does that experience that Megan has shared relate to the work that you did and the analysis that you did? Does it sort of resonate in terms of the quantitative data that you went through before, in terms of bringing those particular capacities to light? Oh, you're on mute, Tim. And you're still on mute, sorry. There you go.
Yeah, I think what what Megan was sharing was so interesting, but I think it was relatively lacking from the literature insofar as we explored it. I got to caveat that by saying that the review that we conducted, the papers we collected were probably, the collection point was probably at the beginning of 2017, and then subsequently it was all about analyzing these, writing these up. So there's been like 3 years probably since then. So I can't really speak to the last few years. So there may well be things that have emerged, studies that have emerged in the interim. But insofar as, speaking from the point of a few years ago, there really wasn't much data on these more positive metrics, say in terms of leadership, emotional regulation. As I said, a lot of the research is more focused on the kind of so-called deficit-based outcomes, like the mental health outcomes, given the origin, as it were, of mindfulness in an academic context, which has come from the clinical sphere with Kabat-Zinn and mindfulness-based stress reduction. So a lot of the literature is still weighted towards that. I think there's lots of reasons for that, partly because there tends to have more of a gravitas anyway in academia. And I think, as Megan mentioned, there's somewhat of a skepticism, I think it's eroding and fading, but nevertheless a skepticism towards mindfulness generally, and then combining that with a skepticism around more positive constructs, as it were, like mindfulness, like emotional regulation, leadership, in terms of kind of serious academic studies and getting these published. So at that point, I think there wasn't much of a focus, but hopefully that's changing in the past few years, and I would expect it to carry on changing, because people are obviously waking up to the importance, of these kind of outcomes. So at least insofar as we saw it, there wasn't that much, and also on other things you might be interested in the workplace, like creativity. I don't think there was any study on creativity, which seems strange to me. And so obviously in our papers, we had recommendations for what people could and should focus on, in addition to the mental health constructs. So things like creativity and leadership. So hopefully the picture is now changing.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, I'm going to completely demonstrate my ignorance here, and I can, because I'm the layperson, not the specialist. So, but some of the things which you were sort of highlighting as having a positive and statistically demonstrable impact would seem intuitively to lead to better capacities in leadership. So, highly stressed leaders tend not to be empathic, in my humble experience. They tend to be very closed down, unempathetic, unable to have that meta perspective. So if you're able to reduce the stress, just one of the metrics you flagged, then presumably there's a potential for connectivity with the other sort of higher leadership functions, as it were.
Yeah, I think you're right. Intuitively, you would expect all these outcomes to have an impact on leadership. So even though leadership wasn't assessed directly in most of the studies, as you say, all these other metrics are relevant to leaders and leadership. So to the extent that leaders are less burnt out, less stressed, less depressed, less anxious, you would think, you'd hypothesize that this would impact upon the quality of their leadership and of their teams. So I think just because the data is missing doesn't mean it's not there, as it were. So it's not that it's been shown not to have an impact, it's just it wasn't measured. But I would expect that if it had been measured in those studies, you probably would have seen a positive impact too.
And also what strikes me as you're both sharing is that it kind of provides us as both champions in the workplace and trainers as almost two tiers of evidence. There's the empirical evidence around this helps with these health health metrics, if you like, around stress and anxiety. And then there is the work that Megan's done to demonstrate the impact on leadership. And as we've discussed as a group, it is essential to get the leaders on board, as well as to be able to provide the case for the people who are participating if you're doing group training as well. So it's fantastic, dual attack, if you like, on this credibility question.
And I would just add, in terms of what was missing from the research base, I think particularly to looking to persuade leaders and managers, cost benefit analyses are really important, because obviously if you can see an impact on the bottom line, not that's all that matters to them, but obviously it's important. Hardly any studies did that, but I did find a handful, and the ones that did, it was quite striking, the kind of the cost benefit ratio, the amount of investment it took for a mindfulness intervention, more than paid off multiple times over in terms of the impact. So that was something else we encouraged, was to, more cost benefit analysis. So hopefully there's been an increase in those, because I think they are particularly persuasive. So, if you are looking to convince a leader, if there's if you can attach those kind of numbers to it that speak to what they're, that aspect of the business, then I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim. So Megan, can you expand a bit? I'm going to be self-indulgent, and I'm going to ask if you could expand a bit on this speaking truth to power work that you've been doing, and particularly that disrupting habits, because I think that, particularly as you describe at the moment, the challenges that we face through COVID, post-COVID, and it really does seem of the moment. So would you mind sharing some of your insights from that?
Sure thing, yeah. And I just what I think of it, just connecting, and just want to reiterate something that Tim was talking about there, is language really matters, obviously, when you're in front of a leadership group. And I am, in terms of evidence-based, one of the things I usually do at the beginning of a workshop is I'll show them that, you'll have seen it probably, that graph of peer-reviewed journal articles on mindfulness over the years, and be very clear that, the vast amount of evidence base here is in clinical, has arisen from clinical settings. And there's very little really still in the leadership world and the management world. However, yeah, you may want to extrapolate between the two, particularly at the moment, because over the last year, the managers and leaders I work with, not just managers and leaders, we have an obsession with managers and leaders, don't we? People are really stressed, yeah? And so, it's not a great leap to go from one to the other. And there is a preference for quantitative work. And I know that in my Speaking Truth to Power, we've worked on this for 6 years. We've interviewed hundreds of people, run loads, probably thousands of workshops now. I also run a survey, and I've surveyed 8,000 people. And that is what I kick off with, because people look at numbers and then they sit up. Leaders and managers especially, and if it's their numbers, even better. But I did want to raise that, when we look at the evidence base, isn't it interesting that there is this desire for figures and numbers, and in my experience, the richness of qualitative work in this area is so influential. And actually that the model, which is through our qualitative work, has probably, been far more effective than some of the quantitative work I've used, just because it makes sense to people. They're like, oh yeah, oh right, yeah, no, it does, yes, I get, I get what you mean. So if we can combine those two, ways we look for evidence, I think it can work well. The work combining Speaking Truth to Power and mindful leadership is very much work in progress, and I'm kind of forming hypotheses in my head about this. So just before I came on here, I spent 2 hours with an executive team of an NHS trust who are grappling with people, you know, speaking up, and people being very worried about speaking up. And they were, you know, talking about how they might try and shift and change that. And it was very personal in terms of, well, how by the end of it, we got to the stage where they all know what they need to do.
Hello. I'm trying to turn this volume down.
Hello, Fiona. They all know what they need to do. You know, they know the kind of mistakes that they're making when they cut people off, or they send certain signals, or, you know, they're not speaking up when they know that, my God, if they're not speaking up, nobody else will speak up. You know, they know, but they haven't got, they're not noticing in the moment, because they're so stressed and because they're so busy. And so a lot of my focus this year is, how can we help leaders remember what they already know? You know, we spend hours developing them and training them and getting them to, you know, have empathy. And actually, many of them know this and find it really important, but they're lost on autopilot during the day, and they don't have a moment to think about anything other than the next target. So I'm probably not answering particularly your question, but where my research will be focusing is in how we can create and protect spaces for leaders and managers to remember that they have choices, and to notice those moments where they might choose differently, particularly in order to enable people and invite people to speak up, particularly the voices that are not currently being heard. And of course, you put that in a hospital setting, and when you're not hearing voices that need to be heard, it ends in tragedy. So that's the connection. And the more I work with both areas, the more they overlap. You know,
There's that wonderful quote, isn't it, that mindfulness isn't difficult, it's remembering to be mindful that's the challenge. And I think, yeah, as you know, I worked in central government, and so talking truth to power is a subject close to my heart, and it's incredibly interesting area, which I think is you know, at a societal level is important because of all the risks incurred in us either forgetting our responsibilities as leaders, or being under such pressure that the fear of consequences overwhelms those choices. And I think that the opportunity to disrupt those processes through practice is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Tim, did you have any reflections on that? I can see you're off mute. I didn't know if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's so important what Megan's talking about. I was also thinking about the importance of qualitative research, and I do just want to echo that too, because I personally prefer doing qualitative research, but actually I think the most powerful research is mixed methods, when you do combine the both. So I was going to say, you know, if anyone here is undertaking research or is looking for research, I think that's maximally persuasive, because I think some people might be more moved by numbers, let's say, but I think maybe not everyone, most people are moved by stories too, and by personal accounts. And I think the most impactful accounts manage to incorporate both, because stories and personal accounts are very valuable on their own, but a skeptical person might just suggest that, you know, they're cherry-picked, it's selective, it's anecdotal, and so on. But, you know, vice versa, I think just numerical data alone doesn't really convey the impact that something like mindfulness can have on people's lives and kind of its potential for personal transformation and so on. So if you can weave these together in a mixed approach, I think is the most kind of impactful way of showing the impact. So I would just I would encourage people to seek out, and if conducting studies, to also build those two elements in. And there's lots of nice ways of weaving those together, because I think, you know, we are interested in making a difference, and not convincing people, because, you know, it's obviously want it to be evidence-based, but essentially making the best case we can based on the evidence. And I think the best way to do that would be to bring in these two components. So just to add that in, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thank you. Yeah, Megan, you look like you wanted to.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's very astute there. I was just going to say as well, you know, that I think everybody here absolutely understands is, you know, that the language, the phrase, you know, mindfulness and meditation are such loaded terms. And that's also very useful to kind of, you know, try and get straight with people. And I'm always trying to be very clear that I don't possess the right definition. Nobody possesses the right definition of meditation or mindfulness. They mean as many different things as the word leadership. But I can be clear on what I'm talking about. And that always helps as well, particularly with a skeptical audience. Trying to get people to talk about all of we play a kind of word association game. You know, what comes to mind when you hear the word mindfulness? And you know, how did you turn up to this workshop? Were you thinking woohoo, about time, or were you thinking, oh my goodness? So the language matters alongside the evidence base, and it's an intricate dance. As Tim says, not to kind of convince. In fact, the more you try and convince, I've noticed, the least likely people are to go there. But more enabling people to be curious and open their ears, I suppose, and hear. Yeah.
And I think in a sense that's strangely why some of the less significant results can be also useful, because it shows the appraisal is realistic. You know, if we were to walk in and just say it's a panacea and is, you know, universally beneficial for everyone, it can sound like you're evangelizing for mindfulness. But if you can say on most metrics it's positive, but the impact varies, and in some metrics not so much, then I think that helps to convey the impression that, you know, your appraisal is, you know, realistic rather than kind of rose tinted, as it were. You know?
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
And also just to make the point that, again, being careful, but mindfulness isn't for everyone. And like I did mention some studies where it didn't have an impact, some studies where I hesitate to use the word, you know, risky or dangerous, but, you know, some people don't benefit and it may even be harmful to them if there's contraindications for certain people. And that's a fast changing literature too, but to be, you know, sensitive there about not kind of imposing it upon people and to recognize that it doesn't necessarily suit everyone. And I think that's also just part of the message.
Thank you. Wow, I knew it was going to be tricky doing this in an hour. And I have a strong feeling that we could make this into a day-long workshop, to be completely honest, although you may have other things to do. Would I be right to say, Teresa, that there are some questions that are coming into the chat? And can I invite some questions? I think we probably have time for maybe one, maybe two questions from the floor. And I'm sure that you'll understand why I haven't, why I've let the panel explore these topics, because there's so much to explore. But if there is a question that people would like to ask, or one that you can pick up, Teresa, then I will quite happily ask it.
Can I ask a question just about just one thing that I'm very interested about for Megan is when you go in to talk to these people, do you go in as a mindfulness practitioner or do you go in as a leadership consultant? So, I mean, are you saying that all the tools that I have wrapped up and brought to this leadership day fall within the category of mindfulness? Or do you keep it slightly broader? So I'm bringing in all sorts of, you know, reflections and psychology, neuroscience, and, you know, so I'm just interested how you describe those tools that you use.
Thanks, Chris.
It depends. I think on the group that I'm there with, on what I think is helpful to use in terms of terminology, why they've approached me in the first place. So I would say I more often go in as a, as a leader, a leadership professor, and that labels count. That's part of my work in Speaking Truth to Power, is that all of these different labels that we apply to ourselves matter. They convey status, power, assumptions, misunderstandings. So there's a variety. I guess it's a good, really interesting question. I have a variety of labels that I can put on or emphasize to particular groups: researcher, academic, professor, mindfulness teacher. There's a range of them, and it's very useful to consider that, and to consider the consequences of which of those you emphasize with a group. I did once famously have a large bank, who will remain nameless, asked me a few years back. They said, could I do a conference with them MDs on mindfulness? And they said, but could you not mention the word mindfulness, please, for an hour? I just thought it was brilliant. So yeah, I think it really does depend. But I definitely, if I haven't mentioned it at the beginning, I am mentioning mindfulness and myself being a practitioner when maybe people's ears are open to that a bit later on in the session, if that makes sense, Chris. It's a really useful thing to think about. How we show up and whether people can hear us has a lot to do with how they're labeling us in that moment. We can't control that necessarily, but we can influence it.
I've introduced ideas that I wouldn't mention the M word with certain clients, because they felt so aggrieved at the prospect of using the word mindfulness. Nima, I think, has asked, what was your response?
I'm afraid I was rather mischievous, and I said to them, would you like me to call the session "Training the Mind for Peak Performance"? Which they didn't see my mischievousness at all, and said yes. And I then went back and went, you know what? I can't remember what we called it. We didn't put mindfulness in the title, but people showed up knowing it was about mindfulness, and that's why they were there. So it's quite an interesting one for the training and development people, actually. I think, but to be fair, they were really worried about being judged about putting it on. And it was insightful for them to realize that it ended up being the most popular workshop because people really wanted a mindfulness workshop. So it's interesting how much more open actually leadership groups are becoming in this territory. Yeah, so that's been helpful over the last few years.
That's wonderful. So it is with a heavy heart that I have to report that we're out of time. We are, as you can imagine, being inundated with questions. So if we may, we'll collect those up and we'll forward those on to you. And perhaps if you have a moment, we'll capture your replies and send those out to the community members. Just want to give you an enormous thank you, a huge thank you. And yes, indeed, virtual round of applause. For all your insights and wisdom. It's been a hugely important session for us, and thank you very much for all your time, Tim and Megan.
Thank you.